My name's Jack. I'm a developer evangelist in London at a company called Pusher. I'm coming to the GDG group in July to do a talk on React. So the first question really is why should people learn React and what makes it different to all the other JavaScript frameworks? The first reason I'd say to learn React, and I think there's a few of them, is that React is it's been a bit of a game changer really on the scene of JavaScript frameworks. Pre-React, we had a lot of people doing the Angular knockout kind of two-way data binding style of application, where we tried to replicate server-side architectures on the client. So Angular, for example, and Ember in its early days did this MVC, this model view controller structure, which was mostly kind of found via Ruby on Rails and other server-side frameworks that had that setup. Over time, though, what we found is that doesn't really work so well for client-side applications, and we started moving towards this component-based architecture, which is really the architecture that React pushed and was one of the big mainstream frameworks, had, of course, helped by the fact that it had people at Facebook behind it and that kind of large team there. What we do is, instead of building applications as models and views and controllers, we build them as a series of small components, which you can almost see as like building blocks. So instead of building kind of large applications with large controllers and lots of code in one place, we build lots of very small components that might represent a tiny bit of your website. And then those components have other components inside them, and we build up large applications from these series of components. Now, whether you think React is a great idea or a dreadful idea, the fact of the matter is that this idea of building with components has really become very popular. Angular 2 focuses on a component-based approach. Ember 2 kind of deprecated controllers and is moving towards encouraging people to build with components. React is purely component focused. There's other libraries like Vue.js, and I'm sure there'll be lots more coming out that focus on this idea of building as a series of components. And I think this is the idea that we will be using for the foreseeable future, particularly if you then look at web components, this idea that we can build these components natively in the browsers with full browser support. We're not there yet, but that's kind of the direction we're heading. So in the future, hopefully, we'll have these libraries like React and Ember using components where the underlying actual components are web components, and we'll gain a lot of performance from that. So the main reason for me that you should learn React is because this component architecture isn't going to go anywhere. And whether you love or hate React and its syntax and some of its particulars, that doesn't really matter, because I think the ideas in it are very, very important. Additionally, it is one of the big frameworks at the moment. A lot of people are building a lot of applications in it. There's a very big community around it. We've just seen like React Europe was a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of conferences, there's a lot of content, a lot of people blogging and open sourcing React related projects. So it's a really good community and an ecosystem to be in. It's a very active one. So the next question really is, what would you say is the key reason people should consider React for building their JavaScript applications? And what I would say here is that the thing I love about React is it's got a much smaller footprint than the other libraries out there. So it's much more, it will just deal with taking these components and putting them into the browser, and that's kind of it. And that's its offering. And it has quite a small API for doing so, and I like to think it's fairly straightforward. What this means, if you can take like a React app and compare it to something like an Angular or an Ember, one of those traditionally more bigger kind of fully featured frameworks, you get a lot more out of the box for free with an Angular, an Ember, and those kind of things. But you do sacrifice a little bit of control. With React, you do have to spend a bit more time putting all these React and then maybe a React router for the URLs and Redux or Flux, or one of these kind of data state management libraries. You spend a bit of time and effort putting those together, but you do keep a bit more control. I like React because of that fact, because React actually is quite small. I can write a lot of code in my React application that actually isn't React focused, that is just plain JavaScript. And I can merge in other libraries where it makes sense for me to do so very easily, because there's no framework set up. There's not like, you don't have to hook it into like Angular's module system, for example. I'm not saying that Ember and Angular are bad frameworks. I really like working with them as well, but I think you lose a little bit of control for a bit more, for more provided out of the box, and it's really your decision on which one you prefer. If you like a bit more control, you like writing more plain JavaScript and less boilerplate framework-specific code, I think React is a really good choice for you. Can React integrate with a pre-existing JavaScript application I've created using a JS MVC framework, brackets Angular, Backbone, etc.? It's a really good question. It's a very common one as well, in that if you've got this app in, let's say Angular for argument's sake, and you want to move to React, you obviously don't really want to you don't really want to rewrite all of that in one big go. It's going to be months and months of writing code without being able to ship any new features because you're just rewriting your existing app in React. Because React has that really small footprint that I mentioned, it's quite a small library and it's quite focused, it is very much possible for you to integrate it into something else. So you might have this big Angular application, but you might choose to swap just a little bit of it out for one React component. All you then have to do is spend a little bit of work, but not too much, hooking up kind of the Angular view into the React component that's there. It's definitely doable. There's a few blog posts out there on it and a few kind of code examples on GitHub. You can definitely kind of move incrementally. And the way I would do this, say I had a big Angular app, is I'd pick the smallest component on my website, one of the more straightforward bits on there, and I would try and swap that out to a React component, and I would build up from there, if you like, until before you know it, hopefully you'll have more of the code in React and less in Angular, and then you reach that tipping point where you start to be writing React as much as possible. Additionally, another way to do it would be just the next feature you build, the next smaller thing, build it in React and spend the time hooking it up that way. So yeah, good question. Is there any risk that React might fade / stop being developed on? It's a really good question. In this kind of day and age, there are JavaScript frameworks popping up all the time. Every day there seems to be a new one. There'll be a blog post telling you why the one you're using is dreadful and why you should swap to this other one. I think with React, the first thing I would say is that, as I mentioned earlier, the ideas behind React, this component architecture, the idea of setting state and the way React works is the key, and that will exist in 5 years' time. Even if we don't have React anymore, we will have whatever the next new thing is that will do that, and it will be better than React because otherwise it wouldn't replace React, but it will probably use a lot of the ideas that React introduced. So I think React's worth learning for that alone. Secondly, React currently powers Facebook.com, powers Instagram. It's worked on by a big team at Facebook who pay them full-time to work on it. There's a humongous community around React, lots of React conferences. There's a lot of companies kind of who exist as React companies, either as like training or consulting or contracting, that kind of thing. So I think whilst, I couldn't sit here and say I guarantee React will be around in 2, 5, 10 years' time, I think the chances of it being around for a while are pretty good. Yeah, I'd certainly be willing to back it. So the next question is about the tooling in React. I've heard that React suffers from a tooling problem where it's tricky to set up all the tools required to build a React application. I think this is partly true. I think that there are certainly some tooling issues with React, or particularly a lot of the React projects on GitHub or blog posts or tutorials will often need you to set up a tool called Webpack, which is like a JavaScript bundling tool, and then Babel to convert your ES 2015 or your ES6 code back into ES5, or to convert the JSX, which is the HTML-like syntax that React lets you write in JavaScript, converting that into plain old actual JavaScript that can be executed. So there is a bit of an overhead when setting up React. You can do a whole load with React and tooling as well. You'll see a lot of blog posts on that hot reloading, which is where we write our new code and we save, and it runs in the browser without a browser even needing to do an actual refresh. So you keep all your state and you just re-execute that bit of code that's changed. And the build tool, Webpack, and others are capable of doing that. That's great. It's certainly not something you need to get bogged down with when you're starting to learn the framework. So I would say React doesn't have a tooling problem. The problem comes from when people fairly new to React try to learn React at the same time as learning all the tooling and all the extra stuff around it. Focus at the beginning purely on React, then maybe look into other libraries and other tools as you gain more confidence with the framework itself. The tooling is very powerful and it's great and it's really fun to work with, but you definitely don't need all that complexity when you're just getting started. Does React work on mobile applications? This isn't something I have huge experience with myself, but I'd be willing to bet yes. React kind of prides itself on being very efficient in how it works and how it updates the browser. In addition, there's also React Native, which is the same idea but building actual native applications using React. The way this works is kind of cool because it doesn't convert your JavaScript into like Objective-C or the Android Java equivalent, but it runs all your JavaScript in a web worker, effectively in a side thread on the mobile device, which turns out pretty performant and a pretty good way to work. So there's React Native if you do want full-on mobile experience, and there's lots of people are having big success working with React Native apps and have them released on the app stores and so on, but React generally should be fine on a mobile device as well. The next question is, what prior knowledge is required to start learning React? I think that's a really good question. I would say not much, actually. I'd say all you need to have to work with React is a good grounded knowledge in plain JavaScript. The difference between React, I find, in other frameworks is you write a lot more plain JavaScript and a lot less boilerplate framework-specific code. So I think it is important to have a good understanding of JavaScript itself and the language and its behaviors. If you have come across any of the new functionality in ES 2015/ES6, the latest version of the language, that will probably stand you in good stead. A lot of the libraries written around React and a lot of blog posts often feature quite a lot of the new syntax. So if you're familiar with ES 2015, that's a plus. But you certainly don't need any of that to be able to write React applications. A lot of people write React apps just using the current state of JavaScript, kind of ES5, and maybe the odd thing that's supported across all the browsers they need. So, experience in another framework or building client-side JavaScript applications is certainly beneficial, but I think all you really need is a solid understanding of JavaScript itself. And that's another reason I like React, is people who learn React tend to improve their plain JavaScript knowledge as well, because React exposes you to quite a lot of it. Okay, so next question, how customizable is React? E.g., how far can the look and feel be changed to suit the application? React gives you full control in this regard. React does a very good job of doing what it does very well and then getting very quickly out of the way to enable you to do all the other stuff you want. So this isn't a thing where you have to write weird templates to get it to work properly. You get full control over all the HTML that's outputted, what it looks like, what classes it has applied, what attributes it has, so on and so forth. This is entirely down to you. You'll find a lot of libraries out there. I think it's called Material UI. There's like Google's Material design framework ported into a set of React components. So there are ways to get started with things like that. I'm pretty sure there's also like a Bootstrap React, which gives you the Twitter Bootstrap themes in React. There's a few, but all they really are just small wrappers around regular HTML elements with the specific classes applied. So you get absolute full control over this, and you don't need to worry about anything getting in the way. Nothing will prevent you. So the next question is, how does React fit in with other technologies, e.g. Angular, Ionic, or Polymer, Google Web Components? Does it replace them? I think this depends on kind of your experience with those libraries. A lot of people use these together. We spoke earlier about having like an Angular app and porting it to React and doing it bit by bit. React can definitely play in that space. If you've got an existing app and you want to start experimenting, building maybe a little bit of it in React. And similarly, you could drop a very small React app into an existing website pretty straightforwardly. This isn't a framework where you have to rewrite the whole thing in React. You can do that incrementally. I think really, if you're using React, you wouldn't look to use anything else like an Angular or even something a bit smaller like Web Components, a Web Components polyfill, which gives us the full Web Components in the browser. The reason behind this is React kind of is that, if you like, the whole point of React is we build components, and React lets us do that via its own APIs, and it deals with putting them into the browser and keeping them up to date and re-rendering them and button interactions and all the rest of it. So if you're using React, you basically have your own version of Web Components, if you like, in the page. Now, of course, React doesn't adhere to the Web Component spec. They're not equivalent. They have a lot of differences, but it's the same kind of idea. React just gives you a bit more around this idea of components. In the future, maybe once Web Components are fully supported, we might see React use those under the hood. We don't know. We might not. We might see other frameworks pop up that use Web Components natively. That's kind of quite an interesting space. I'm interested to see what happens with that as Web Components get better support and frameworks adapt to that. But for now, if you use React, you don't really need anything else. React kind of gives you all the stuff you need. The only thing I would say is React, because it's that smaller footprint, it's a smaller library, it does a bit less for you. When you use React, you'll find yourself using other libraries to get everything kind of working as you need. For example, React doesn't provide like URL support like Ember does, so you'd have to add, say, React Router and lots of things like that. So with React, you do have to pull in more libraries, but they're all React-related libraries. It's very rare that if you've bought into using React, you wouldn't need to install Web Components or Polymer or even like a jQuery or anything like that. Normally, you just stick with React and kind of almost the sister libraries that are out there with it. Is React.js is built for large apps with data that changes. Can it take huge amounts of data? Yes. So the way React works under the hood is it builds up when it needs to keep the browser in sync with any data changes is it builds up what's called a virtual DOM in memory. And what this is it's what the DOM would look like with the latest set of data that React has been given. It will then compare that with the real DOM and figure out how basically it needs to update the real DOM to make it match this virtual DOM that it's got over here. And it's very good at doing that in a very efficient way to keep the number of DOM mutations or edits to the actual browser DOM down and to keep itself efficient. So out the box, really, there's no need to worry about React performance. It will cover itself in glory for most of the time. But as you start working with larger sets of data, you might see yourself slowing the page, kind of slowing down a bit. This often isn't React's fault. It's just that you can often give little hints to React via code to tell it that you can be a bit more performant in certain areas, or maybe it needs a better way of knowing how to compare and check if data has changed. So what I'd say is actually for most apps you'll very rarely hit a big performance problem in React. It's very good at staying performant. If you do start to hit problems, there are a number of kind of documented solutions in the docs. React is very good at giving you console warnings if it thinks something isn't quite as efficient as it could be, and it will give you a hint on how you could fix that. And finally, React provides a performance add-on, a plugin for React, which will let you really dive deep into like the nitty-gritty performance of React and when it's re-rendering and why it's having to do the actions it's doing. So out the box, React is very good at being performant. It can deal with large sets of data. You might need to do a little bit more to help it do that, but it provides all the tooling that you would need for you to do so. So how do you think the use of React.js will be affected by the next release of Angular? So I'm really interested to see what happens with Angular 2 and how it's adopted and how popular it becomes. It's an interesting approach. It's very Reacty in a lot of ways, and this idea of components being core to everything. It's obviously very different in a number of other ways. It's kind of TypeScript by default, lots of kind of extra stuff provided. But still, you've got the large backing of the full Angular framework behind you rather than the smaller React framework. My honest answer is I don't think it will change too much. I think that people who pick Angular will stick with Angular and like it a lot for the most part. Maybe a few people will swap between the two. But I think generally people who have picked React often have done so because they don't like the idea of Angular or vice versa. So I wouldn't expect it to change too much. It will be interesting to see comparisons. I've built a couple of apps using the Angular 2 release candidate. Personally, I do prefer React, but I think it's more just a personal preference as to which style of coding and application you like. I feel with Angular, I write a lot of code that's very Angular specific, and I have to know a lot about the framework itself. With React, I feel like I need to know less about React because it gives me less, and I can just focus on writing JavaScript. So that's why I personally prefer React. Your mileage may vary and pick Angular. I don't think Angular 2 is a bad framework by any stretch of the imagination. I'm sure it will be a good framework to work in. What are the downsides to choosing React? I think this is a really interesting question. The main downside for me, and it's one that basically comes with a trade-off, I think, with React. You trade the fact that React is smaller and it gives you less with the fact that you will then have to spend more time pulling in these extra libraries to give you functionality that other frameworks like Angular, Ember, and so on will give you out the box. So, for example, React Router is the popular kind of routing solution for React, which is an external library you have to install and configure. Then you might have things like Flux or Redux, or one of these kind of data management libraries you'd have to pull in. If you want to make HTTP requests, React doesn't give you that out the box. You know, there's no like React HTTP service, so you might decide to pull in something to help you with that, and so on and so forth. So with React, you expose yourself a bit more to this whole JavaScript fatigue thing, which is I don't like the terminology, but the idea that you have to work with multiple libraries and pull them all in, and you might be more exposed to the additional break and change that might give you a bit more work to do. Additionally, you have to write a bit of code to hook all those things together and get them all playing nicely. The upside of doing that is you have full control over your application. There's no kind of hidden magic going on. It's all very explicit and in front of you, which is why I'm willing to trade that off, because I like React's APIs, I like being explicit in my code, and I like having control over which libraries I can pull in, and if one's a bit weird, I can swap it out, or I can write my own small one, whatever I need to. If you contrast that with Angular or an Ember, the point there is that they provide all that stuff for you, so it's all out of the box, and you might think that's great, but I think you sacrifice a little bit of control over doing so. So it's really up to you if you want a full out-of-the-box package, or you want something like React, which does that one thing really well and lets you have control over everything else. React rethinks established, quote, best practices. What would you say to someone who is uneasy about JSX, inline styles, etc.? It's a really good question. Just to provide a bit of context, JSX, for those who are unaware, is an HTML-like syntax, if you like, that React lets you write in your JavaScript components. So in your JavaScript React application, you'll have like return and then what looks like a heading 1 tag and then like hello world and the closing heading 1 tag. That doesn't actually run. What happens is we run a kind of transformation before we execute in the browser. So we take this heading 1 hello world and we turn it into some JavaScript which will say react.createElements bracket heading 1 as a string. So it does get converted to JavaScript. It's not a random syntax that React has made work in the browser. We do just convert it before we run in the browser. But it is something that's now very, very common across all React applications. The reason it's good, the reason JSX is a good thing, is because it's just way easier. People are used to dealing with HTML. It's a good language. It's very good at its job. It's a very expressive way of declaring markup. And it's nice to work with. So we can keep that in our JavaScript and have something very similar that's nice for us to work with as developers. I've also found JSX really, really good for people who aren't developers, maybe designers, or one of my React websites I built was worked on by people in the HR team at the company I was at to update the job listings on the website and stuff like that. So JSX is really good for that. For someone who's slightly uneasy about it, I would say that I was too, and I think it's something very common at the beginning of meeting React is this idea of what is this HTML in my JavaScript. I think you have to remember that it's not that. It is JavaScript in your JavaScript. It's just a little bit of syntax that's being converted for you that just makes it easier for you to work with. Because it's just that little bit of syntax as well, you could easily swap out JSX and not have that. And you could just use the React create element calls, the kind of bit more explicit way of doing it. Or there are other small libraries that let you write all that HTML in JavaScript, so you don't need that extra conversion step. And by picking JSX, you don't bind yourself into using it forever. You could easily convert it into non-JSX, take that code and work from that. Inline styles, this is the idea that we actually define our CSS inline through JavaScript as objects that we pass into our React components. I personally haven't got a huge area of knowledge across kind of inline and CSS modules and CSS and React and how those will combine nicely. But I have seen a lot of benefits to doing it this way, like the fact that all your CSS then is scoped to this component, so you don't have CSS from component A affecting CSS from component C over here or how it's rendering. But I would say, again, it's entirely opt-in. I built React applications where I haven't used any of this. I've just used class names and styled it as if it were plain HTML. I've done some where I've used inline styling completely. It's more a question of personal choice for you and your team. I think there are a number of issues with CSS that we can get rid of by writing it in JavaScript, but it's up to you how you feel comfortable about the fact that we're writing CSS in JavaScript if you'd rather keep it as is. I don't think React will force you to use inline styles at all, so I don't think that's too much of a concern. What will be covered in the Google Developers event on the 6th of July. So this is the reason we're doing this Periscope, this broadcast is for the GDG meetup on the 6th of July that Set Squared are involved with. What we're going to be doing there is a kind of a talk on React. So it'll be an introduction to React aimed at people who haven't come across it before. But we'll also, at the end of that, there'll kind of be a bunch of like resources and exercises and things that you can do to go a bit further with React and get started with it yourself. We'll also do kind of a bit of a Q&A, and I'll kind of play it by ear a bit. So we'll probably do some like live coding and we'll do a bit of a presentation. It'll just be a night kind of talking about React, but aimed at people who haven't had React experience before. So please don't be put off if you've not played with React or haven't written any React. That's absolutely fine. That's kind of the point of the evening. You mentioned earlier Twitter using React.js for aspects of their app. Are there any notable apps that primarily use React? So I don't know if you mean apps as in mobile apps or web apps. I'm going to take that to mean web apps. I think Facebook is entirely powered by React, pretty much. As always, when someone asks me this question, I now can't think of any examples. I believe the mobile Twitter application is the web app, rather, so mobile.twitter.com is very much powered by React, maybe fully. I can't quite remember. But the point is there are a lot of people writing kind of big React applications out there. And I think it is a framework that can be used both for very small applications, which I've used it for, and very big applications as well, which I've not got quite so much experience in, but I'm working towards. So I think it's definitely a framework that can cope with all scales of application and can scale up with you as you need to. Beginners are very much welcome, as we said. All kind of skill levels, more than welcome. Hopefully it'll be a really fun evening. Thank you very much for tuning into this broadcast. I hope it was useful. You can find me as Jack_Franklin on Twitter, or go to the JavaScriptPlayground.com to find me there as well. So thank you very much to Set Squared for sorting this out, and they've done all the admin here. I've just rocked up and answered some questions speaking into my phone for half an hour, and we will hope to see some of you on the 6th of July. So thank you very much, have a great day, and we will speak to you soon. Goodbye.